Hi, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Sebastian Grube. I work with the NYU Abu Dhabi Art Gallery as the Community Engagement and Marketing Officer. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's or today's conversation with Safiya Noble and Zach Blas. It's part of our series called Navigating Digital Identities. This is the last conversation in that series out of 4 in total. This one is called Bias and Inequity in the Digital Space. And each of these conversations investigated the different aspects of how we inhabit the digital space and what kind of issues we encounter in that space. And the entire series is in accompanying our virtual exhibition at the NYU AD Art Gallery called Not In, Off, Along, or Relating to Align. And Zach's work is part of that exhibition, 2 of his pieces. He'll talk about them shortly. And with that, just some logistics and housekeeping notes. We're recording this meeting for it to be later published on YouTube. So if you don't wish to appear in the recording, we would just kindly ask you to please keep your cameras off. But you are still more than welcome to engage in the chat, say your hellos, ask your questions, respond to the conversation, and give comments. This will be brief. We're looking at about an hour conversation in total. And the first, we'll start off with Zach giving a short introduction, then going to Safiya. Then both of them will engage in a conversation. And after about the first 30 to 35 minutes, we'll open it up to everyone. You'll be able to unmute yourselves if you wish to speak and ask questions or give comments, or you're more than welcome to use the chat, and I'm happy to read out your questions for you. And with that, I'm really excited to hand over the virtual microphone to Zach to get us started.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to this. Let me just jump right in by sharing my screen, this little presentation. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna try and cram a lot in here because I like getting a lot on the table. So we have options for things to talk through. And I just wanted to go through elements of the works that I am presenting in the exhibition with the gallery. So first, I'm going to talk about this work called Face Cages, which I made between 2014 and 16. And this work was very much trying to look at and visualize and present the structural violence that facial recognition impacts or imparts specifically upon minoritarian communities, persons broadly. And I decided to approach this through the genre of feminist endurance performance art. So I collaborated with 3 people to make this work, and I'll get to them in a minute. But what I want to highlight first is the way that I decided to make this work was I developed a really strong aesthetic obsession with this particular type of mapping that facial recognition does, which is called landmark mapping or plotting. And this you see this now commonly when faces are being tracked in real time, where you have a kind of set of dots planted along a face and a grid forms, and that grid can move in real time when a face is being mapped. And I was really taken by this because it's often something we see on the screen. It seems very pliant, very colorful, very lightweight. You blink your eye, it moves. You're like, oh my God, wow, this is so amazing. And I wanted to find a way to take this biometric diagram or grid, which, the promise is that it's some kind of 100% perfect calculation of an individual's face, and find a way to give this some weight. And when I say weight, I mean political weight and historical weight. So my kind of way through this, and why I got super interested in this idea of focusing heavily on biometric capture and how that implements reductive standards, was I would really kind of obsess over image like this, which, you look at this image of the perfect white heteronormative family, and they all have successfully achieved recognition. It seems like, easy enough. But then there are plenty of examples that we've seen over the years where people that don't fit this dynamic these identity markers aren't so easily recognized by biometric machines or facial recognition, and often kind of fall out of these systems, or they're misrecognized. So it could be when a person who's not white has been asked if they blink, if they're blinking when blink detection is going off with the camera, or it could be a researcher who is Black. This is part of the Algorithmic Justice League, where a white mask has to be held up for a Black person to even be recognized by a facial recognition device. So I worked with a group of people, and we basically scanned our faces, got our biometric diagrams, and then we took those and actually fabricated them in metal. And we made them in metal for a number of reasons, to kind of connect to elements of criminalization like prison bars and handcuffs, also like longer various histories of facial punishment, whether that is what was used during slavery in the United States or in the medieval period in Europe, when women, for instance, were forced to wear certain kinds of facial muzzles for different types of punishment. And what we did was, so this is everyone in the work. So there's me, then the Iranian American performance artist, Ellie Merman. There's the trans Latina artist, Misha Cardenas. And then there is the Black queer artist, Paul Mpaji Sapuya, who's based in LA. And this work was all made in California, at the which was where I was based at the time. And we created these metal face cages. And what we learned when we were doing the prototyping for this is that when our measurements were made into a three-dimensional object and put back on our faces, they actually didn't fit very well. And some of them were very painful. Some of them made our faces bleed. And so this kind of became the work. What happens when you take this seemingly virtual, lightweight, colorful biometric diagram of a face and you turn it into something heavy and physical, put it back on the face, and there's actually a physical mismatch. So this was a way of trying to perform and dramatize the incongruency between this biometric reading of the face and the actual fleshy embodied person. And in that style of feminist endurance performance art, we actually wore these for a camera. So the way that the work is installed, it looks like a series of portraits, but they're actually videos where a person is sitting very still and looking at the camera. And the prompt was to, do this as long as you can bear it. And, the idea was that you're kind of seeing this struggle play out in real time, over time, through duration. And, when you set with these, you do start to see these kind of little moments of flinching and things like that. So this was an early work of mine that was really trying to think about algorithmic bias or structural violence, and just trying to really set specifically with facial recognition and power, and who is it discriminating against and punishing. Okay, so totally different direction. The other work I wanted to put on the table is Contra Internet, which is a really big work I made for a number of years, and a very small video from this work is featured in the exhibition. And what I really want to focus on is this idea, Contra Internet. As an artist, I often like to come up with concepts. I like to create concepts that become kind of discursive framing devices that I make work around. And when I began doing the Contra Internet research, I started seeing different kind of master narratives of the internet. And one I called Killing the Internet, which was the increase around the world of the internet being shut down during politically tumultuous times, which we saw during the Egyptian uprising. We've seen it in Iran and Turkey and various places around the world over the years. Another I called Disappearing the Internet, and I'm taking a note here from Eric Schmidt, who at the time was the CEO or chairman of Google. And in 2015, he was asked at the World Economic Forum to predict the future of the internet. And he says, it will disappear. It's like a California prophecy if there ever was one. And, this idea is more along the line of the Internet of Things, of a kind of totalized corporate takeover of the internet, where basically the internet somehow magically disappears into the world, and you can no longer have a distinction between the internet and the world. But I noticed, I mean, there are many different kind of offshoots, but for me, there was a third story that I was very inspired by during this research, which was different types of groups. They could be artists, activists, technologists around the world that were building literal alternative networking infrastructure. And what I thought was really exciting about this, such as this group in Detroit, the Digital Stewards, that were building community-driven mesh networks, wireless mesh networking systems. What I found really inspiring was that by actually trying to build alternative infrastructure, the horizon of possibility was really shifting. That this opened up a kind of other view of what might be possible beyond the corporate internet as we know it. Now, I almost made a documentary about this, but I had to accept that as an artist, I'm much more wacky and gravitate towards like exuberant queer sci-fi rather than a documentary. So I ended up making a queer sci-fi film around this and kind of speculating on the beyond of the internet as we know it. But to do that, I first developed this idea of contra-internet. And I took a note from this book, The Electronic Disturbance from 1994, written by this art collective, Critical Art Ensemble, which I learned through Ricardo Dominguez, where they talk about plagiarism, and they have this really interesting concept they call utopian plagiarism, which is a way of experimenting with citational politics, and you develop an idea out of someone else's. So what I did with this utopian plagiarism in mind was I worked with this manifesto by Paul Preciado, the transfeminist queer theorist and curator, and I started to work with the Contrasexual Manifesto, and I liked how in this manifesto, Preciado basically offers a really provocative theory of the dildo. And for Preciado, the dildo can't be that, it's not the same thing as a penis. It's not the same thing as anything phallocentric, and develops this whole kind of experimental approach to the dildo as a conceptual diagrammatic form that can unlock your contrasexuality, which is a way of experiencing sexuality beyond heteronormativity. And there's all these kind of wild exercises with this dildo, which I experimented with some in the early days. This was one activity in Istanbul and Turkey. But I basically took this question, for Preciado, the dildo was this form that unlocked contrasexuality. So for me, I was like, what is the form that could unlock the contra-internet? And this is also maybe where you can see as an artist, I really had no idea what contra-internet meant, but I was really gravitating toward that and kind of thinking like, this is a refusal of a kind of normalized relationship to the internet, but also trying to open up some kind of alternative possibilities. And so I made an installation around this, a film installation, which we can talk about. And I had this kind of queer, contrasexual, contra-internet figure doing this dance that basically destroyed this totalized network world. And the work in the exhibition is this really short video where this kind of famous network diagram of a distributed network, the network itself, the diagram is ripped away, and all these little bits that are kind of trapped within that network diagram are kind of liberated and freed in this kind of like wacky outer space vibe, where this work, however conceptual and abstract, is trying to kind of imagine like a different type of world or form of political organization that might emerge out of that. Okay, I am stopping. I've reached my time. Thank you so much, everyone, and I'm going to hand it over to Safiya.
Zach, it's so amazing to get to be in your company for me this morning in Los Angeles, where I'm joining everyone from the Gabrielino and Tonga people's land that has not been ceded, where I work and live. And, just thinking about the liberatory promises of the internet and what your work has done. I feel more like a respondent to your work than anything, even though I know, the goal here is for me to share a little bit about myself, and I will do that. I just want to, first say that the work of artists is so incredibly important in this world. And I think that what you have done in your work is really help us visualize and understand many alternate narratives to the way in which Silicon Valley and Silicon corridors around the world have articulated these alleged promises of freedom, which are in fact probably anything but. So I just want to openly, just as we get started, say that I'm in awe and I can't wait to figure out how to work with you. This work is so fine and so important. So let me just say a little bit about myself and how I came to thinking about these issues of kind of bias and inequity in the digital space, because I know that's the subject of our time today. Currently I work as an associate professor at UCLA, and I co-founded and co-direct the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, which is a nascent research center at UCLA. We're about 2 years old. And I think of us as in many ways as kind of a feminist outpost for people interested in the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, and technology, and who are our center, foregrounds people and communities before we center the technology. This is quite different as a model, as a research model, from other internet and society institutes around the world that tend to foreground the technology and the digital. And people are maybe kind of the landscape upon which these projects are enacted. We tend to think that people are, and our loss of agency, in fact, our loss of power, the kind of systematic disenfranchisement and disempowerment that comes with a variety of networked technologies should be the driving conversation. So how we kind of arrived at that is, I'll give the shortest version of that story that I can, which is, it's been a decade now, 10 years ago, that I kind of conducted this first systematic study of the most profound advertising engine in the world, Google, that had fashioned itself and marketed itself as a knowledge epicenter, and thinking about the way in which its claims to organize all the world's knowledge were in fact displacing all kinds of different localized ways of knowing, local knowledge centers, schools, libraries, parents, communities, elders, and was attempting to kind of represent the world in a stable, reliable, allegedly credible way. So when I started that study, it really was, Zach, I wish I had known you then, because it was really kind of in a similar tradition of trying to make legible the failures in such a system like a global search engine. And one of the things that I did in that early work was to look and see how women and girls of color in the United States were portrayed in such a system. And one of the things that, of course, became the kind of headline opening case study for the book that I wrote called Algorithms of Oppression was the way in which, when you did keyword searches on Black women, Black girls, Latina girls, Asian girls, you were bombarded on the first page of search results with pornography. And of course, you didn't have to add the word sex, you didn't have to add the word porn. Girls of color just became synonymous with pornographic objectification and were synonymous with kind of sexual commodification. And there was no space for any other way of knowing ourselves, and for those who might come across those results to know us differently. And so I began asking a series of questions over several years about these types of failures that happen in technologies that we think of as highly credible, stable, vetted, reliable. And of course, part of the logics that we see both in Zach and your amazing work and in the work that I've done is that what we're dealing with is the alleged stability of data, right? The alleged truthfulness that these technologies not only market to the public and convince themselves of, but also train their workers in thinking that they are doing. So this is where we've had, for example, only their last 4 or 5 years, maybe 4 years, of an acknowledgement by software engineers, by global tech companies, that there could be such a thing as bias within their products and services, within the technologies that they're building. But what has elicited and or maybe kind of forced a recognition is, and I love that you had this, image of Joy Buolamwini from the MIT Media Lab and, her gender shades study where she is not recognized in her Black woman face until she puts on kind of a white mask. And there's so many dimensions of that. I mean, I could write a whole paper on Joy and Timnit Jabril and Deb Raji's incredibly important gender shades paper using that kind of Black skin, white mask, Frantz Fanon, theorization, because what we see is that there is this kind of hegemonic, dominating agenda, set of imperatives. I don't think so much a coincidence, but a collusion between states and the tech sector to extract every dimension of our humanity, commodify it, and then sell it back to us as if it's a site of freedom. And this, of course, is so powerfully represented, Zach, I feel, in your face cages work, where we have this idea that somehow it's more convenient. It's a narrative that it's somehow so much more convenient to have a retina scan or a face scan to get on the airplane than it is to not. Except that what we know that there are tremendous failures of these technologies over and over again. So I think part of what this opens up as a question, maybe for us to think about as we launch into our conversation is, do we want to be refining and perfecting these technologies so that we are more powerfully recognized, so that we contribute to their to the stabilization of these kinds of projects? Or is our project to resist, disrupt, dismantle, abolish? Now, there's a lot of people on a broad continuum of scholars, activists, researchers, journalists who are studying these things and have, that's my note to tell me, wrap it. It's my wrap it up. So I certainly find myself, over 10 years when I first started looking at these kinds of challenges, very clear about the types of vocabulary words that we use and the way in which we describe these processes and practices that we're trying to intervene upon. So where I love that, there's a recognition, for example, of bias. I think that we have more powerful words like discrimination and oppression that really help us crystallize the power asymmetries that are happening in these projects and that you've so beautifully illustrated in your work. So I think I'll leave it there, just maybe as an opening, as a jumping off point. I mean, there's so many things that I would love to talk to you about, especially at the kind of local. I mean, I know we're both Angelinos or lovers of Los Angeles. And, this is a place and a space too, where these kinds of tensions, certainly we're seeing like an influx of people from Silicon Valley moving down, the expansion of Silicon Beach in Los Angeles really changing the landscape. So it's not just the technologies, but it's all of the practices around the making and the supporting of these types of projects too, that leads to incredible displacement, gentrification, housing shortages, I mean, all the things that we could talk about, lack of affordability. I often tell people when big tech says it's coming to your city, you should, organize the protests, not welcome them with unlimited tax breaks. So I'll leave it there as just maybe a jumping off place for us to go. And I'm really thrilled to be in conversation with you today.
So wow, that was amazing and incredibly generous. And I was starting to type, but then my brain was going too fast for my fingers, so I just had to stop. And there's so many things I want to say, but maybe I'll just respond to some of that, the questions that you just flagged. And I love that you asked this question about what should we do? Should we be trying to refine algorithms like facial recognition to get them to work more precisely, or should there be this more kind of fundamental, or just a kind of resistance and abolition? And honestly, over the years, I've realized I actually kind of pick both, and that I think that you can kind of work on different that you can work on both of these points in different ways. And I think that there's clearly an element in that I try to hold in all of the artwork that is much more organized around kind of abolition, refusal, kind of rejection. And I think one of the things I like to do as an artist is it gives you the ability to operate on different political levels, that might actually feel more utopic, more speculative, but that is actually sometimes I think it's important to hold that in the work as an artist, because art has that space for having these kinds of political visions that might be really hard to manifest practically in the present. And then of course I feel very conflicted about how to kind of practically deal with something like facial recognition in the present. And I guess at the same time, it's here. So this is where I feel this tension of, on the one hand, I want to completely refuse and take this more, whatever you want to call it, radical utopic position. But then at the same time, there's another part of me, a more maybe practical part, that wants to try and find a way to engage with this since the technology is here. And I tried to do that actually with the Contra Intranet work, where I tried to hold these two things together around the idea of the network, and kind of thinking, okay, I liked how Preciado was experimenting with the dildo. And when I asked that question, what is the dildo tectonics of the internet? My answer is like, well, it can't be a network. The form, like this, like utopic political form, it could not be a network. And I absolutely have no idea how to answer that in a practical register. But for me, that's where this place of art can take you, to actually begin to imagine some type of political organization beyond the network form. But then at the same time, when we look at what's happening on the ground politically, we see all this amazing activity around, building alternative network infrastructure, with activist groups and technologists around the world. And that, of course, they are building networks. And I think, when I was making Contra Intranet, I realized like it's actually really important to hold both of these things together and give them both space. What needs to happen practically right now, but then also having that kind of imaginative thrust of something beyond all of this.
Yeah, one of the things that I really love about the Contra Intranet, one of the images of where you peel back the network and leave the pieces, is that the empty space within the network is actually not empty. And of course, this is science too, So I mean, I really appreciate the kind of thinking. We think of the power being the nodes and the lines connecting those networks. And yet there's something in what we imagine as empty space. But what you've done is you've shown it in form, the empty space as a form. And I think of that form, I mean, for me, because it's art, so I get to make up anything that I want about how I feel about it. So what I experience when I look at that is those are the masses of community, of people, of formed relationships that exist, that are big and large, right? Sometimes encompassed by a network, by the lines and the nodes around that space. But that is actually larger and more powerful just physically than the line and the node. So, there's something about these kinds of metaphors that I think are really important for us to remember, because, in my work, I'm so kind of singularly concerned. And I don't, I'm so not a fun person at a cocktail party when someone's like, it's like after tennis practice, they're like, what do you do? And I'm like, don't even ask, because you don't want to know, because I'm going to wreck your life. But, I think about all the time what these kind of totalizing technologies will do to undermine the possibility for agency. And for those of us who come from communities who have historically been oppressed and are contemporarily being oppressed, the loss of agency must be refused. It must be, because we know in our very recent past, I think about this in terms of my grandparents. My grandparents, on my dad's side were sharecroppers, and my grandfather was sold to a white man in Philadelphia when he was a child. He, born in the Gullah Islands, and then was emancipated when he was 16. But he was essentially sold to a person, and my grandmother was a sharecropper. And together in their marriage over time, they purchased all of my grandmother's relatives out of sharecropping. And this is how we came to all be in California. So I think about, this dimension of my family and how the refusal for the totalized control over our lives is actually not 200 years ago. It's recent in our lived experience today. And I know that this is one of the things that to me has made these issues so much more legible, is that women, people of color, I've seen so many, quite frankly, Black women and LGBTQ women and non-binary people, queer people, really being at the forefront, and women of color at the forefront of making these criticisms legible. And I think part of that is because we have this kind of tacit experience and knowledge with control over our bodies, over our communities, over our families. And so I just add that because I think, the work that you're doing, it's, I'm thinking of, 10 different ways that our center, for example, at UCLA, I mean, we think about that policy and culture are the two most important levers for shifting the world and making the world a more equitable and fair and empowered place. Policy, because, for my parents who were born under segregation, the law of the land actually overdetermined what was possible for them. Full stop. So policy matters. The laws on the books matter. We don't have enough laws on the books with respect to internet and control. And, and I'm not just talking about personal data privacy. I'm talking about whether we should live ensnared under these systems or not. And culture. And this is where I think of, your work is so powerfully informing different kinds of imaginaries. So I guess I'm wondering too, like where you feel the imaginaries in your work might evolve too, because I'm thinking about, these kind of evolutions in my work as well.
Yeah, actually, one thing I really took away from what you were saying, which I think about a lot in my recent work, is who gets to control who is able to have a vision or who is able to be a visionary. And one thing I actually noticed recently, I was asked to speak at this Nam June Paik exhibition a couple years ago at the Tate Modern, and I was doing some preparation for that. And I found an article reviewing the exhibition that described him as a visionary. And that actually really kind of threw me, because I thought, wow, artists are never described as visionaries today. That is just actually very rare to hear an artist talked of as a visionary. But I was like, there is a place where I always hear people described as visionaries and where you can get awards for being a visionary, which is in the tech industry. And this is something, I've just thought about a lot, about who gets to control, what a vision is, who thinks one has access to a vision, who gets to act on their vision, which is really, right, a kind of fight about the future and the horizon of possibility. And so that's something that I feel like my work has shifted in more recent years, where earlier work was kind of trying to make more tools of resistance. And I think now I'm making this work that's more really setting with power structures and trying to pull out these the struggle around vision. And actually one way that I've been doing that in more recent work is to really focus on what are the fantasies and beliefs that are really motivating a lot of this motivating this vision in Silicon Valley, which has taken me to strange places. Like, I've done a lot of work on magic and mysticism recently, because you start to realize how deep this interest is in magic and mysticism, and conceptualizing how tech companies are working with data analytics today. But yeah, that's just to say that I think I'm really trying to hold that place in the work and let the work show that this is an active, ongoing struggle around who gets to have that vision of the future, which is completely, what is at stake is the horizon of what appears possible and who gets to act on that possibility to begin with. There was another thing I wanted to come back to, and then I do have a question for you, which was actually love that you flagged in your talk, thinking about definitions, because I taught this undergraduate class when I was still at Goldsmiths on the arts of surveillance, and a huge part of that was about vocabulary building, and actually thinking one of the things that's so important is to actually build a much more robust, precise vocabulary for talking about surveillance today, which is a word I really don't like, because I feel like it says everything and nothing. And so just trying to kind of have this more precise vocabulary. And I think your point about, calling things, right, oppression or domination is, and I think you said discrimination as well, right, is like, it really drives the point home. And okay, within that, I was wondering, when you were talking, and I think you kind of answered this, I thought your point about focusing on people was really incredibly interesting. And I've never actually heard someone frame it that way, that's studying contemporary issues around the internet. Because one question I was thinking about was about, access and how you conduct your research. And it's something that I hear students ask, and also young artists, right, that are interested in digital technology, because everything has become so commercialized. There's always these struggles around gaining access to software, or they might want to get involved in thinking about AI critically, but actually don't even know where to begin, because how do you get access to the technology and how do you start to learn about that? But your point about focusing more on the people was really a fascinating one, and I could see it could lead in a really different pathway, and it shifts the I guess the questions around access for doing research or artwork, whatever you're doing.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, so I want to say a quick word about the words that we use and the framing, and maybe try to speak to both of those things that you and your question. One of the things that I think we also need to do is figure out how to deconstruct and abolish certain kinds of words that have become normative, make them either passe or, kind of like so meaningless that they can't be used. And so surveillance is one of those words. Another one of those words is data. So data is a terrible word. If you think about the kinds of projects and work that we're doing, it's a useless word. It actually is one of those words that depoliticizes and defangs the social processes of making data, deploying data, weaponizing data, using data, right? So you don't really understand. People, for example, believe that data is stable and that it's truthful and it's reliable. And so many data scientists, at the point, for example, that they receive data, they don't question its sources, its veracity, whether there is 300 years of discrimination baked into that data. They're just using the facts, right? And so this idea of contesting words like data, what if we call data 300 years of, or even 30 years or 5 years of information collected on people without their consent, without their knowledge, and with that may not accurately represent them. What if we call data that? Because that's also what data is many times. What if we call data a snapshot of a person or a phenomena in time that is immutable in the mutable body and lived experience? What if we called data that? And then we said, we're going to build the world on top of that one snapshot in time. I mean, does anybody here in this conversation with us watching today want the worst thing they did when they were 17, that snapshot of that point, to overdetermine the rest of their lives? See, when we talk about and deconstruct these words, we actually have so much more power, because we're, again, centering the humanity and the human experience and the experience of non-human beings too. So I think, when I was starting my work, I had when I was a graduate student, I was asking these same kind of questions that your students are asking you, which is, how do we do this? And people had many, many different ideas for me about a purely technical way to ask the questions about misrepresentation and oppression in large-scale digital systems. And all of their recommendations were about studying what the technology is doing. Well, if you can't have the algorithm, you can't make these claims, right? This was the kind of the prevailing logic 10 years ago. You have to remember, 10 years ago, we didn't even have algorithms that wasn't a widely conceived of term that kind of everybody could get in on. When I was saying algorithms could discriminate at a level of race and gender 10 years ago, I mean, it was hard to find 4 people who would sit on a dissertation committee and put their careers behind that. They would just argue me and say that's just not possible. I mean, I don't even know how I got a PhD, because at the time, nobody wanted to believe that. Now, this is common sense. But I know that part of what made my research legible for several people was that I focused on the history of Black women and girls, the histories of people of color, of Black people, of anti-Black racism, of how white supremacy works in many different kinds of structures, including technological structures, and always keeping that at the forefront. Well, there's a very rich literature. We have many, many ways to talk about that. And then we have kind of a legibility of what the technology is doing, what it's reproducing over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. So I think part of what, for me, it was, and there were people who also said things like, well, you have to ask all the Black girls how they feel about being represented pornographically. And of course, these are people who have never been women or women of color and Black women and girls. The last thing I'm going to do is show some children pornography and ask them how they feel about it. I mean, so the logics fall apart too, because I think researchers they lose sight of the person, of the people sometimes, that you would never do something so reckless and irresponsible. So I think that has been a strategy for me in my work, to kind of keep the centering. And I will just say, as we open up the conversation to more people who want to ask questions, and we really do invite the questions and the comments, I've really been looking forward and thinking about the Maori people in New Zealand who have been working so hard on internet governance laws in New Zealand that guarantee the protection of data, kind of the data rights and protections for 7 generations into the future, and for the earth, and for non-human inhabitants of the earth. And that is so powerful to me, again, when you talk about who can have a vision. When I think about people who have come from, are the descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, are the descendants of the Holocaust, or her descendants of genocides of their peoples, that those peoples make it to another place out of those are visionary people. those are also the people to listen to, because they really are not having a vision from a place of privilege and power and capital. Those are people emanating a vision. I mean, we are the vision, the manifest vision of people 2, 3, 10 generations ago. And I think those are things to keep in mind too.
Thank you so much, Safiya and Zach. I want to jump in here quickly to open up the conversation to everyone else who is here and encourage you to ask questions either in the chat, or again, if you want to unmute yourselves, please feel free to do so. Just a logistical reminder that we are recording this meeting, so if you don't wish to be visible in the recording that is published, but you want to ask a question, just feel free to turn off your camera. But really, the floor is open to you all.
Hi, my name is Monique Thomas. I'm actually here in Los Angeles, in California as well, and LA, this beautiful sunshine. And I'm a program coordinator at the Center for Diversity at Caltech. So all of this really sort of resonates with me, because it's this combination of, sort of science and diversity and bringing these conversations to light. And Dr. Noble, I was so struck by your characterization of data, right? Because coming from a STEM institution, data is holy and it is objective, and it's something that we don't change. And I'm wondering, what do you think, how can we change that paradigm of thinking in data in different ways, of being immutable, of being something that, right, that it is a snapshot in time?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think part of our critique of these different kinds of data-driven systems helps us to do that work of making these issues legible. And certainly science and technology studies scholars, especially feminist STS scholars, have been trying to make the instability of things like, certain dimensions of scientific racism, for example, right? Or scientific gendering, scientific sexuality, legible. So we've been at this for a long time, since longer than probably you and I have been alive. So I think we have to keep incorporating those epistemologies into the work that we do as we're training engineers, and that kind of truly interdisciplinary work is extremely important, because then we see the limits and the multiple points of view. I mean, one of the things that I always think about with Meredith Broussard's work in her book, Artificial Unintelligence, she talks about this concept of techno-chauvinism, which is, this kind of emboldened way of being that gets trained into engineers and data scientists who think that their work is infallible. And I think that for artists, again, I will go to Zach, to your work. What artists do is actually help us, and social scientists and humanists, I think also, what collectively we do is show the close reading, the contours, the nuance, the lack of predictability, in many cases, the broader explanation for how something comes into being or into existence, or why something is the way it is. And I think that is so, so important to keep impressing upon students who are coming into engineering places, and certainly at a place like Caltech, that would be a model. Caltech is also a school that's a model for the nation in terms of engineering practice. And so one of the things I often think of, this is Zach, where I agree with you that we have to do multiple things at one time. We have to also get the top engineering schools that set the leadership standard for both the industry and for other universities and colleges to take seriously these kinds of critical theoretical takes on data and technology.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments or thoughts that you have? Really, anything is welcome. Heather, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, wow, such an amazing conversation. I'm just so grateful for both of you. I've been taking notes here the whole time, and it's just really brilliant. And there's so many things that you've already addressed, but maybe one to go a little bit deeper into thinking about this new forced recognition of bias, discrimination. oppression. So one might think that that's become pretty widespread now, this kind of critique. And on the other hand, has it? So that's sort of a question, is, has the criticism that needs to happen actually become widespread? And what's next with that? Or how does what's happening now shift the conversation that for both of you that you're having around these criticisms?
Safiya, should I go for it first? Yeah. I think Heather and I have known each other for a long time, so I think you'll probably know this. But my way that I guess I see this is like the conversation is happening on a very large scale today, but I actually feel like what Safiya was pointing out, a lot of nuance it drops away, and it's actually about trying to bring back those specificity of terms. So when I was making this early biometrics work, and I had this other work that went with it, which was these masks that were based on collective composites of people having this collective face that couldn't be recognized by biometric machines. And all these journalists just devoured that work because it just happened. I was making that work when the Snowden revelations came out. And, it was just like kind of by pure coincidence. I was like, what is happening with this work? And I got so irritated how they conceptually framed the work, because it was all about surveillance and privacy, that was like the holy grail of like, this is the struggle. These are the dynamics. And I was just always like, wow, this is actually not what this work was about at all for me. And when my conceptual way of framing that work was capture and opacity. And that's what I wrote my dissertation on. And, for me, it was like capture and opacity really totally shift like what's happening, what is the mode of power, what might one be struggling towards. So I guess that's actually kind of what I see, is that the topics are really circulating really heavily, but I find that a lot of nuance drops out, and we fall into these like really tired formulations that Safiya already pointed out, where everything is just kind of crammed in around surveillance and privacy often.
Yeah, I would just add, I think that's so true, Zach, what you're saying. And, I try to reality test how much uptake there is about, the shift that might be happening by looking at, for example, what's happened in the past decade in the way that we talk about these issues. I mean, I certainly don't feel like I am a far, far outlier talking about these issues anymore. I feel like now there are hundreds of people that I know around the world who are talking about these issues. But then when I talk to my husband, he's like, no one knows anything about this. So, he keeps it real for me, even though I feel like I'm in a much bigger community of scholars, journalists, activists than I ever was before. I guess, my litmus test is always, my Black family in the Midwest. Do they know what's going on? Well, if they don't know, then we don't know. We haven't done the work yet of really making the concerns legible. So yes, I think certainly being invited here to this incredible event, I mean, that we are having this conversation in the context of, this incredible art exhibit, and in Dubai, and with NYU, and kind of thinking about this kind of globally. This is newer. I think we still have a lot of work to do, and I do think there's a sense of urgency. Zach, for me, it's one of the reasons why your work and the work of your collaborators, I mean, Misha, Cardenas, love their work, and the impact that it's having. I mean, all of you, like, there is a sense of urgency, I do think, about these conversations, because there will come a time when it will be extremely difficult to undo the codification and normalization of these practices. One of the reasons why it's so important to study history, when I first started as an undergrad, I studied colonial history. Like everyone's like, why would you study such a boring area when you're 18? And I did that because I wanted to know, how did it become normal to develop the transatlantic slave trade? How did that just become, and what you learn is that it was a slow, subtle, policy by policy, one city, one colony at a time set of practices. It became a matter of like low-level social organization. And, you know, these things don't just necessarily come from on high, from the federal government or from the United Nations or from the EU. A lot of times it's just the subtlety of social practice and political practice. And those are the kinds of things that I think about right now in this moment, that we will look back and think, you know, will it take us 200 years to undo the subtlety of those social practices?
It's time for one more question.
I don't want to, if somebody has one, they should go, but if not, I have one. There's one.
Julie Valentine, yeah.
Yeah.
How can we move digital exhibitions into the classroom that further explores art, science, and DNA? Or is this already happening? I don't know who wants to speak to that. I know we have some educators in the room as well. Zach, yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's, I mean, I don't know, I can only speak for myself and the other arts educators I know, but I think a lot of these digital exhibitions that are happening in the wake of the pandemic, I mean, I definitely see them being brought into the classroom, and they become a way of, you know, almost doing like an exhibition tour together with your students, where you can have those conversations. I guess, I don't know if that's a broader question about just, you know, people more broadly bringing in art to engage with these political and social topics. And I've always thought that the humanities that are engaging with science and technology quite broadly have always actually had a really good relationship with the arts. And you know, I think back to the 90s when you had cyberfeminism or tactical media, these kind of early heydays of digital media and the internet, and the academic theoretical work that was being done was actually so deeply entangled with political artwork. So I think that relationship has actually often been quite healthy. And I think, you know, what the arts, you know, have to offer is that well, there's different, this is a question I get when I always teach the surveillance class. The students are like, we can't do anything, we might as well quit. Art doesn't stand a chance against any of these topics. But I think, you know, art can offer a few things. You have artists that actually document, you know, that kind of present like where, you know, a building is maybe that has some type of control or power within the system. You know, artists also kind of speculate and imagine differently. Artists can show the fallibilities of the technology, right, by messing with it and breaking it and ripping it open to show, oh, it's not as strong and steady as stable as you thought it might be.
Yeah, thank you. Safiya, do you want to add anything to that? Or?
No, I think that's really potent.
Great. And I think with that, I'm just going to also give a short plug for the art gallery here, talking about classroom engagement and bringing art and digital art into the classroom, which is something that is so crucial to our mission as a university gallery being attached to New York University, Abu Dhabi. So as staff, if there are any educators in the room, no matter where you are, if you are teaching a class and you want one of our curators or even some of the artists that are part of our exhibitions to come into your classes to talk about the exhibitions, that either the virtual exhibition that we currently have right now or any that we've done in the past. Any one of us is always, especially Maya, is happy to come into the classroom and talk about those works to really, and to talk about them in an interdisciplinary way, to connecting sciences, social sciences, not just staying within the arts and humanities. It's really kind of close to what we hold dear as a department of the university, and that's close to our missions. And with that, I just want to thank both Zach and Safiya. I want to thank everyone who was part of this space and part of this conversation for coming. I also want to give a shout out to the Office of Inclusion and Equity at NYU Abu Dhabi, who helped us organize this event and produce it. And yeah, if you want to see the virtual exhibition that we have on, I posted that link in the chat. Also, I want to make sure that you get the link specifically to Zach's work, the video that he was referring to that is part of the exhibition that's also now, you can see that in the chat. And then 2 more things on our YouTube channel. This is where we'll publish the recording of this conversation. So if you are dipping in and out, feel free to check that out next week. We'll publish the full recording there. And then last but not least, our exhibition is up until July 10th. So for just 1.5 more weeks, so make sure to visit it on your mobile phone. And then I also want to give a shout out to another program that we're co-producing with the NYU AD Institute and Heather Dewey-Hagborg and Jörg Blumtrit, who are part of this meeting. It's called An Oral History of the Internet, and they're conducting videos with artists and pioneers and thinkers and theorists and philosophers who are involved in the early kind of experiences of the internet, and are talking about their experiences, how they've changed, how their views have changed, and how they think about the structures and the ways we engage with it today. And we've just today, and Zach has been referring to this artist, Ricardo Dominguez, we published the recording with him today, and we're publishing one every week. So I just posted that link in the chat as well, so you can check it out there. And with that, again, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for being here. And I hope you have a great night, a great evening, afternoon, morning, and day, and week ahead. Thank you for joining us.